I was 3 blocks from the hospital, still in my scrubs, carrying the box they had given me to clear out my locker when I heard them. Not one, two, coming in low from the northeast, dropping fast, the kind of descent that does not happen in a civilian context without something having gone badly wrong. I stopped walking. The box was in both hands. The rotors were getting louder, and I could see the shapes of them now against the early morning sky, and they were not news helicopters, and they were not police, and the markings on the sides were the kind of markings that mean a different category of urgency entirely. They landed in the hospital parking lot I had just left, and then someone was running toward me, and they were shouting my name. I had been a trauma nurse for 9 years when they let me go. 9 years is long enough to have built something that feels permanent, long enough that the institution and the work and the daily rhythm of the place have stopped feeling like a job and started feeling like the structure your life is organized around. When that structure is removed, the first thing you notice is not the absence of the job. It is the absence of the purpose that the job had come to contain. St. Aurelius Medical Center was a Level 2 trauma center in a mid-sized city, which meant it was busy without being the kind of overwhelmed that the largest urban trauma centers deal with. We saw serious cases regularly: vehicle accidents, industrial injuries, cardiac events that arrived through the ED with the particular urgency of things that are not going to wait. We also had a small wing that had been added 4 years prior in a partnership arrangement with the Regional Military Affairs Office, serving active duty and recently separated military personnel who lived within the center's catchment area and whose care needs were being managed in the civilian system under contract. I had been assigned to the trauma floor for 5 of my 9 years there. The previous 4 had been in the ED. The transition had been at my request. I had found the sustained relationship with patients over days and weeks more personally useful than the rapid cycle work of the emergency department, which is to say I had found it more honest in a way I did not always know how to articulate. The trauma floor required you to be present with someone through the full arc of a crisis, not just its acute peak. I found that work more demanding and more real. The floor's staff had the particular cohesion of people who had worked through serious situations together, without any of the situations having broken them. Charge nurse Dominic Farrow had been there 11 years and ran the floor with the specific authority of someone who has simply been there too long to be wrong about the things that matter. He communicated in short sentences and had a memory for patient histories that I had never seen matched. He was not warm in the social sense, but he was deeply reliable in the professional one, and over 5 years I had come to trust him in the way you trust a person whose reliability has been tested and held. The attending physicians rotated, which was the nature of the floor's staffing model. There was one consistent figure, Dr. Leonard Fitch, the floor's medical director, who had been in his position for 7 years and who I had developed a functional working relationship with over my 5 years on the floor. Fitch was precise and somewhat territorial. He managed the relationship between nursing staff and medical staff with a clear sense of where each group's authority ended, and his management of that boundary occasionally created friction. But he was clinically sound, and in the environment of a trauma floor, clinical soundness was the metric that mattered most. The military wing was an addition I had actively sought involvement with. I had no prior military service. What I had was an interest that had developed through the patients themselves, through the accumulating experience of caring for people whose injuries and histories were shaped by a context I had not been in and needed to understand better in order to serve them well. I had requested the cross training when the wing opened. I had been one of 2 floor nurses to complete it. Over 3 years, I had developed a practice in that wing that I was genuinely proud of. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand what 9 years in that institution felt like from the inside. Not a job I was indifferent to. Not something I was performing for external reasons. Work that I had built a real relationship with, that I had invested in the specific way that people invest in the things they have decided to do seriously, and that I had done well by any honest accounting. What I did not know, in those last weeks before any of this happened, was that the honest accounting was not the one being applied to me. There was another accounting, one built from different variables, managed by different interests, moving toward a conclusion that had nothing to do with whether I had done the work well. I did not know it was coming. Looking back now, I think some part of me had felt its approach without naming it, the way you feel weather before it arrives. But I had chosen the simpler explanation each time, because the simpler explanation was more survivable, and because 9 years is long enough to make a person believe they have earned the right to trust that the place they have invested in will not do them that kind of harm. I had not earned that right. That was the first thing I had to accept. The discomfort began as texture rather than event. That is always how it begins, not with something you can point to, but with a change in the quality of the air around you that you register before you have language for it. The first texture change was in how I was being communicated with, not what was said, but how. Fitch had always been direct with me, spare, occasionally curt, but direct. In the 6 weeks before everything happened, his communication shifted to something more mediated. He routed questions through the charge nurse that he would previously have addressed to me directly. He acknowledged my reports in rounds with a brevity that had moved past efficient into something else, something that had the quality of management rather than engagement. I noticed this and assigned it to stress. Fitch was managing an administrative restructuring of the floor's documentation protocols, which was genuinely time-consuming and genuinely stressful, and changes in communications style during periods of institutional pressure were not unusual. I gave the explanation its full due and moved on. The second texture change was in the military wing. I had been rotating through the wing 3 nights per week, which was my standard schedule, and the rotation had always been smooth. The patients knew me, the documentation protocols were second nature. The liaison communication with the Regional Military Affairs Office was an established process I had maintained without issue. In the 5th week before the termination, that liaison communication was rerouted. A message I sent to the regional coordinator, a standard status update on 2 patients who were being tracked for transition back to VA care, came back with a notification that my access to the liaison communication channel had been suspended pending review. Pending review. No explanation. No indication of who had initiated the review or why. I raised this with Farrow, who was visibly surprised. He said he had not been notified of any review of my liaison access and that he would look into it. His looking into it produced a conversation with Fitch, the outcome of which was communicated to me as the review was an administrative matter being managed at the director level and that I should continue my regular duties while it was resolved. Continue my regular duties while a review I knew nothing about was being conducted over my access to a protocol I had helped establish and maintained without incident for 3 years. I filed this alongside the Fitch communication shift and told myself that the 2 things might be connected to the documentation restructuring and nothing more. The third texture change came from an unexpected source. A patient, a retired Marine Staff sergeant named Cole, in his 2nd week of recovery from a knee replacement, a man who had been in the military wing before and who I had cared for on his previous admission, asked me one afternoon whether I was planning to stay on the floor long term. I said I expected to. I asked why he was asking. He said he had heard something at the nurse's station the previous evening, when he had been up for a late walk and had passed by without the staff being aware he was in earshot. He said he had not heard the whole conversation. He said what he had heard included my name and the phrase "they're going to have to let her go." He said it the way people say things they are not sure they should say, carefully, watching my face for whether the information was news or confirmation. It was news. I kept it from showing as news. I thanked him for telling me. I said I would look into it. I finished his assessment and went back to the station, and I stood there for a moment at the chart terminal without logging in, looking at the screen without seeing it. They are going to have to let her go. The passive construction of that sentence, the obligation it implied, as though the letting go were something being done by forces outside the speaker's agency rather than by a decision being made by a person, was specific, and it was deliberate. That is not how people talk about a natural separation. That is how they talk about something they are going to do while simultaneously not claiming responsibility for doing it. I logged in. I did the remaining charts. I went home. I did not sleep well. I tried the direct route. That was my first instinct, and I still think it was the right one even though it produced nothing useful, because at least it gave me accurate information about the landscape. I requested a meeting with Fitch. He agreed to see me 2 days after I made the request, which was itself a signal. 2 days was longer than a medical director in a functional working relationship takes to see a senior floor nurse about a professional concern. 2 days was the scheduling of a conversation that the scheduler would prefer not to have. He received me in his office with the careful formality he had been applying to all our interactions for weeks. I said I wanted to understand the nature of the review that had been placed on my liaison access and whether there were any concerns about my practice that I should be aware of and given the opportunity to address. He said the review was a standard administrative process related to the restructuring of the floor's access protocols, and that all staff with specialized access were being reviewed as part of the process, and that there was nothing specific to me in the review. I said I understood. I said I would like to know when the review was expected to conclude and what the outcome process looked like, whether, for instance, there was a notification procedure or whether the access would simply be restored. He said he would look into the timeline. He did not look into the timeline, or if he did, the result of looking was not communicated to me. The liaison access remained suspended. I continued my work in the military wing through the floor's standard documentation channels, which were functional but less efficient, an inconvenience I managed without complaint while waiting for the review that was never described and never concluded. Farrow told me something the following week that I processed slowly over several days before I fully absorbed its significance. He said he had attempted to escalate the liaison access question to the hospital's clinical affairs office and had been told that the matter was being managed at the administrative level and was not appropriate for clinical affairs escalation. He said this had struck him as irregular because liaison access protocols were, by their nature, clinical matters, and routing their administration away from clinical oversight was not standard. He said he had pushed back on this and had been told that the involvement of the military affairs partnership made the matter more complex and that it was being handled appropriately. I asked him whether he believed that. He was quiet for a moment, which was his version of an extended answer. Then he said he believed someone had decided the matter had a specific resolution and was managing the process toward that resolution. I asked if he knew what the resolution was. He said he did not. He said if he did, he would tell me. I believed him. Farrow had never been someone who managed through omission. The red flag that I found impossible to explain away arrived in the form of a document request. The hospital's Human Resources office sent a formal request to my department email asking me to submit, within 5 business days, a complete record of all communications I had had with the Regional Military Affairs Liaison Office over the previous 2 years. Not through the standard records access process, not through the clinical affairs channel, but directly to HR, with a reference code in the request header that I looked up and could not find in any standard HR documentation. A 2-year communication record request, sent to HR with a non-standard reference code, during an unspecified administrative review of my liaison access. These pieces were individual. Together, they formed a shape that was no longer ambiguous. I spent the evening compiling the requested records. There was nothing in them that concerned me. Every communication had been appropriate, documented, conducted through the correct channel, and reflected the standard status updates and transition coordination that the wing's care model required. I submitted the records on time. I received an automated confirmation of receipt and nothing further. I told nobody at the hospital about the document request. I had one conversation outside the hospital with someone who had not been part of my professional life for 4 years, but whose understanding of certain institutional environments I still trusted. I described the situation. They listened. They said to keep documenting and to keep my head down. I kept documenting. I kept my head down. It was not enough. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, which meant I received the calendar notification the previous Tuesday and spent 36 hours knowing a meeting was coming without knowing its purpose. The notification said, HR discussion, please attend. It listed the conference room, the time, and the participants, the HR director, the clinical affairs representative, and Fitch, 3 people from 3 different parts of the institution. That combination does not assemble for a performance review or a process discussion. That combination assembles for a decision that has already been made and requires multiple witnesses to deliver. I went in on Thursday at the scheduled time. I sat across the table from 3 people whose expressions had the specific practice neutrality of people who have had this kind of meeting before and have learned to manage their own discomfort by reducing the interaction to its procedural components. The HR director, a woman named Stiles, led. She said the hospital had completed a review of the access and communication protocols associated with the military wing, and that the review had identified concerns about the management of certain communications that fell outside the standard documented process. I asked what communications she was referring to. She said the review had found instances of communication with the Military Affairs Liaison Office that had occurred outside the standard reporting channel. I said I had submitted a complete communication record as requested, and that every item in that record had occurred within the standard channel. I asked her to be specific about which communications she was referring to. She said she was not in a position to go into the specific details of the review findings at this stage of the process. I sat with that sentence for a moment, not in a position to specify the communications that formed the basis of the finding in a meeting called to discuss the finding. I heard what that meant. It meant the specifics either did not exist or could not survive scrutiny. I said I wanted to understand the process going forward and whether there was a formal hearing at which I could address the findings. Fitch spoke for the first time. He said the review had been thorough and that the concerns identified were serious enough that the hospital's position was that continuing the current employment arrangement was not in the institution's interest. He said this in the particular language of a man who has been told what to say and is saying it with as little personal ownership as possible. The HR director said the hospital was prepared to offer a separation package and asked if I had any questions about the terms. I said I had questions about the substance, not the terms. I said I wanted to know, specifically and in writing, what the grounds were for the separation, because I was not willing to accept a separation package under grounds I had not been given the opportunity to contest. Stiles said the hospital's position was that the review findings constituted sufficient grounds and that the formal documentation would be provided through the standard HR process. I said the standard HR process included a written notice of the findings prior to any separation action, and that I had not received that notice. She said the notice would accompany the separation documentation. I said that was not the standard process. There was a silence in the room. Fitch looked at his hands. The clinical affairs representative, who had said nothing during the entire meeting, continued to say nothing. Stiles maintained her practiced neutral expression. I said I was not going to sign anything at this meeting, that I would review any documentation through the appropriate process, and that I expected the grounds to be specified in writing before I took any further action. I stood up. I said I would continue my current duties pending the receipt of formal documentation. I left the conference room. I walked to my locker. I sat on the bench in front of it for approximately 4 minutes. Not crying, past the threshold where the emotion had a simple physical outlet. Doing the internal accounting that a person does when something has happened that was both anticipated and still, in its actual arrival, worse than the anticipation. The grounds they had named communication outside the standard channel were false. I knew this with the certainty of someone who has kept every record and reviewed every document and found nothing that justified the finding. The finding was a construction. The construction had been built on something, but not on the truth of my practice. What I did not know yet was on what it had actually been built, or who had needed it to exist. I cleared my locker. I put everything in the box they had left for that purpose. I handed in my badge to the front desk. I walked out of the building into the gray of an early morning in March, and I started walking home. I was 3 blocks away when the helicopters came. I heard them before I fully processed what I was hearing, the specific acoustic signature of military rotors at descent angle, low enough and close enough that the sound preceded visual confirmation by only a few seconds. I stopped on the sidewalk. I was still holding the box with both hands. The morning was early enough that the street was mostly empty. A few commuters, a delivery truck, no one paying particular attention to anything until the rotors got close enough that they had no choice. 2 of them, coming in from the northeast, dropping toward the hospital lot I had left 6 minutes earlier. They were not news helicopters. They were not police. The configuration and markings, visible even at that distance to someone who had been working in a military partnership ward for 3 years and had spent enough time reviewing that world's operational categories to recognize its equipment. They were military medical transport. The kind that moves specific people in specific conditions between specific locations on a timeline that does not adjust for institutional convenience. They landed in the hospital parking lot. I stood on the sidewalk, and I did not know what I was watching or what it meant or why it was relevant to me. I stood there because the instinct to stand there was stronger than the instinct to continue walking, and I had learned over 9 years to trust the instinct to stay when something is unresolved in front of you. Then a person came running out of the hospital entrance. Not a nurse, not an administrator, someone in the kind of civilian clothes that are specifically not the clothes of a civilian, moving with the particular purpose of someone executing a time-sensitive task. He came through the lot, past the idling helicopters, to the sidewalk, and he was looking in my direction and he was shouting my name. Not the general directional shout of someone trying to attract attention. My name, specifically, with the specificity of someone who knew the name and knew the location and was running toward a person they had confirmed against a description. I did not move. He reached me in 30 seconds. He said my name again, not shouting now, confirming. He showed identification, quickly, but long enough for me to register what I was seeing, and what I was seeing was not hospital administration and not local law enforcement. He said there was a medical situation. He said they needed the nurse who specialized in the military wing protocols. He said they had confirmed with the ward staff that I was the nurse with that specialization and that I had just left the building. He looked at the box in my hands. He did not comment on it. I said I had been separated from my position that morning. He said he understood that, and that the situation was not something that the separation could affect, and that he needed to know immediately whether I was willing to come back. I said I needed to know what the situation was. He said he could not brief me fully on the sidewalk. He said the patients coming in on the 2 aircraft had injuries and histories that required care from someone with specific knowledge of their background and status, and that the ward staff had confirmed that the nurse with that knowledge was me. He said there was no one else in the building who had completed the cross-training for the military wing at the level I had, and that the patient's care needs were time-sensitive in a way that could not wait for an alternative to be arranged. I looked at him. I thought about the box in my hands, about Stiles and her practiced neutral expression, about Fitch looking at his hands in the conference room, about 3 blocks of empty sidewalk in the morning gray. I said yes. He took the box from me without asking. He carried it as we walked back to the hospital entrance, which was an ordinary gesture and also in some way the most significant gesture anyone had made toward me that morning. I had been carrying it. Someone had taken it. We went through the entrance. The ward staff saw me come in. Pharaoh was at the nursing station, and his expression when he saw me was the expression of a man who had just received confirmation of something he had already understood. He moved toward me. He said the patients were being transferred from the landing zone and would be in the ward in 4 minutes. He said the primary needs he could describe without full briefing were significant post-surgical complications in high-stress contexts, patients whose histories were not fully in the civilian system, and care decisions that needed to be made by someone who understood the military protocol framework. He said he was glad I was there. I said I needed to put on a clean set of scrubs. He pointed to the supply room. I went in. I changed. I walked back out to the nursing station. I asked for the incoming patient files. I started reading. The patients were 2. A man and a woman, both active duty, both arriving from a forward medical facility that had been managing post-operative complications in a field context before the decision was made that the complications required civilian-level resources. Their medical files were partial field documentation, which is accurate in what it records and limited in what it can capture about context and history. What the field documentation did not capture was the supplementary history that the Military Affairs Liaison database held, the background on their specific unit, their prior medical interactions within the military system, the standing treatment notes that existed in the liaison records. I had been submitting status updates for over 3 years, and that the cross-training had qualified me to access and interpret. the liaison access that had been suspended pending the unspecified review. I went to the terminal and entered my credentials. The suspension was still in place. I could not access the supplementary history. I told this to Pharaoh. He said he would escalate it. He picked up the phone and made a call to the Clinical Affairs office. The Clinical Affairs office told him the access review was an administrative matter and that they did not have the authority to override it. He made a second call. I do not know who the second call was to. He moved away from the station to make it, and his voice was low. He came back 2 minutes later and said that someone from the Military Affairs Liaison Office was being patched through to the floor's secure terminal and would provide the supplementary history verbally and through a direct document transfer that bypassed the standard access system. 12 minutes later, the document transfer arrived, and a liaison officer walked me through it over the phone. The information it contained was significant for both patients: prior treatment responses, documented sensitivities, care decisions that had been made in the prior year that needed to inform the current decisions. Without it, the care would have been standard and probably sufficient. With it, it was calibrated, and the calibration was the difference between managed recovery and accelerated recovery, between a week in the civilian system and 3 days. I ran the assessments. I made the care recommendations. The attending physician on duty, not Fitch, a rotating attending named Mirabelle who had come on shift an hour after the separation meeting and who did not know what had happened that morning, reviewed them and approved them. We moved into the work. The work took 4 hours. During those 4 hours, I was inside the function of the role in the way that makes everything else temporarily recede, not forgotten, not resolved, just outside the immediate perimeter of what mattered. What mattered was the 2 patients in the 2 beds and the decisions being made about their care and whether those decisions were as accurate as I could make them. They were as accurate as I could make them, that I can say with confidence. Toward the end of those 4 hours, I became aware of activity in the administrative corridor that was not the normal activity of a hospital morning. Not loud. Institutional crises rarely announce themselves loudly, but directional. The specific quality of movement that happens when people who hold authority within a space are being displaced by people who hold authority over it. Pharaoh told me during a brief break in the work that the 2 individuals who had arrived on the helicopters, not the patients, the escorts who had accompanied the transport, had been in Stiles's office for the past 2 hours. He said one of them had presented credentials to the hospital administration that had produced a response he described as the administration becoming very quiet and very cooperative in a short period of time. He said he did not know the specific content of those credentials, but that the response they had generated was consistent with federal oversight authority. He said he thought I should know that. I said I was not surprised, and I meant it. Something about the morning, the speed of the arrival, the specificity of the request, the particular way the man who had met me on the sidewalk had taken the box from my hands, had told me that the situation was more organized than its surface presentation. People who respond to a medical emergency do not also, simultaneously, address the administrative circumstances that displace the nurse required for the emergency, unless the administrative circumstances were known in advance and the emergency was the mechanism for addressing them. That was a thought I held provisionally. I did not know if it was accurate, but it had a shape that felt correct. The patients were stabilized by noon. Both of them were going to be all right. The care pathway for the next 48 hours was documented and communicated. I went to the nursing station and sat down. Mirabelle passed by and said, with the straightforwardness of someone who had just spent 4 hours watching me work, that she was glad I had been available. She said it as though my availability were the most unremarkable fact in the world. I said thank you. Pharaoh set a cup of coffee on the station beside me and said nothing. I picked it up and drank it. The administrative corridor was still quiet in the way that it had been quiet for 2 hours. Whatever was happening in Stiles's office had not concluded. I waited. There is a particular quality to the emotional state that follows high-stakes functional work. The state you enter after the work has required you to be fully present and fully capable and fully outside your own personal circumstances for several hours, and the work ends, and the personal circumstances are still there, unchanged, waiting for you to return to them. I had been in that state before. I recognized it. What I had not experienced before was the specific version of it that comes when the personal circumstances include having walked out of the building carrying a box an hour before the work began. I sat at the nursing station for a period I cannot accurately account for long enough that Pharaoh checked on me twice without speaking, which was his way of offering presence without requiring response. The patients were stable. The immediate work was done. The administrative corridor was still generating its particular quiet. I thought about 9 years, not the moments that went wrong or the conflicts or the institutional failures. Those were present, but they were not the thing I needed to think about. I needed to think about what 9 years of doing the work correctly actually meant, what it had built, what it was worth. It had built the situation where the only nurse in the building with the right training and the right knowledge for those 2 patients was someone who had been handed a box and walked out the door 3 blocks before 2 helicopters landed. That was what 9 years of doing the work correctly had produced, a specificity of capability that was, in this morning's specific alignment of circumstances, irreplaceable. The people who had prepared the separation documentation, who had identified communication outside the standard channel as the grounds, who had assembled in a conference room to deliver a decision that had been made somewhere above all of their positions, those people had made a calculation. The calculation was that the cost of removing me was lower than whatever the cost of keeping me had become to whoever had decided I needed to go. The calculation had not included the possibility of 2 helicopters. I do not say this to suggest that the 2 helicopters were justice. They were not justice. They were a contingency, a specific circumstance that had intersected with a specific moment and produced a specific outcome. The people who had built the case against me were still in the building. The false finding was still somewhere in the HR documentation. The process that had been used to arrive at it was still the process. What I was sitting with was the more difficult understanding, that I was good at this work, had always been good at it, and that the goodness of the work was not a protection. It had not protected me from the process that had been built around me, and it would not protect me from the next process if the next process had the same origin and the same goal. I had spent 9 years believing, at some foundational level, that doing the work well was the primary protection, that the record would speak for itself, that the documentation would be sufficient, that the institution I had invested in would manage its processes correctly. I had not been naive about institutional imperfection. But I had believed in a version of proportionality, that a strong enough record, maintained carefully enough, would make the kind of thing that had happened this morning unlikely enough to be survivable through the standard process. The standard process had been overridden before I reached the parking lot. The standard process had not been designed to protect people from what had happened to me. It had been designed to protect the institution from liability, and when the liability calculation pointed in my direction, the process had moved in my direction. I was not the first person this had happened to. I knew that with certainty. I had simply been, until this morning, someone it had not happened to yet. The grief of that was specific and large. Not for the loss of the job might be recoverable, depending on what was happening in the administrative corridor. For the loss of the belief, the foundational, operating belief that had made 9 years of showing up and doing the work feel like building something durable. I had built something. It was real. The 2 patients in the 2 beds were evidence of it, and their care records would be evidence of it permanently. But the building of it had not made the ground under it stable. The ground was the institution, and the institution's stability was contingent on factors I did not control and could not always predict. That was the honest situation, and it had been the honest situation all along, and I had known it and not fully believed it until this morning. I picked up the cup of coffee Pharaoh had left. It was cold. I drank it anyway. Then I sat up straight because the administrative corridor had gone from quiet to active, and Pharaoh was walking toward me, and his expression told me something had changed. Pharaoh said, with the direct simplicity that was his only register, that there were people in the conference room who wanted to speak with me. I went to the conference room. The configuration had changed entirely from the morning. Stiles was still there, but she was seated differently, the specific seated posture of someone who has been repositioned in a room, not physically but in terms of authority. Fitch was not present. The clinical affairs representative was not present. 2 new people sat at the table. One of them was the individual who had met me on the sidewalk. The other was a woman I did not recognize, in civilian clothes, who had the specific quality of authority that does not require a title to be legible. She introduced herself by name and by the federal office she represented. The name of the office was one I had not encountered in 9 years of civilian practice. The nature of the office was one I had encountered, indirectly, and through the military wing's documentation requirements, as the oversight body responsible for protecting the integrity of military personnel's medical records within civilian partnership facilities. She said the review that had been initiated against my access and communication protocols had been placed under federal hold pending investigation. She said the investigation had been initiated not by my situation, but by a separate process that had been underway for 4 months. A broader review of how several civilian hospitals in the regional network were managing their military partnership documentation. A review that had found, across multiple facilities, evidence of improper access and manipulation of military patients' supplementary records by administrative personnel seeking to manage insurance billing outcomes. She said the review had been looking for the facility in the network where the manipulation had been most consequential. The evidence had pointed here. She said the communication that had been characterized in my separation grounds as outside the standard channel was not outside the standard channel. It was the standard channel, correctly used. What had been outside the standard channel was a parallel communication process initiated by the administrative layer of the military wing partnership. Specifically, a series of communications between the hospital's billing contractor and the Military Affairs Liaison Office that had been conducted without clinical oversight, and that had resulted in documentation changes that affected several patients' records without their knowledge or their clinicians' awareness. She said the billing contractor had been using the review of my access as a mechanism to redirect attention from the administrative communication irregularities while the billing process was completed. She said all of that in the clean, factual language of an official communication. She said it to the room, but she looked at me when she said the parts that were specifically about me, and the looking was direct and without the managed neutrality of an institution protecting itself. Stiles did not speak during any of this. She had the expression of someone who has received information in a room where she is present but not in control, and has decided that presence without expression is the safest available posture. The woman from the federal office said that the separation action had been placed on administrative hold pending the completion of the investigation, and that my access and position were to be reinstated effective immediately. She said the reinstatement was not a courtesy. It was a requirement of the investigative process, which needed the correct personnel in the correct roles for the documentation review to proceed accurately. She asked whether I had questions. I said I had one. I said I wanted to know whether the patients who had been affected by the documentation changes, not the 2 from this morning, but the patients whose records had been altered in the billing process, were going to be notified and given the opportunity to have their records corrected. She said yes. She said that was a primary objective of the investigation. I said that was the answer I needed. She said she understood why. I left the conference room. I went back to the floor. Pharaoh was at the nursing station. He looked at me. I looked at him. He did not ask me to describe what had happened because he had already assembled most of it from what he had heard and what he knew. He said, "Are you back?" I said I was back. He handed me a patient chart. I took it. The box with my personal items was still in the location where the man from the sidewalk had set it down, at the end of the station, out of the traffic flow, set there with a care that had registered at the time and registered again now. I left it there for the moment. I had work to do. The investigation ran for 11 weeks. I was present for the duration, working my regular rotation, contributing to the document review when it required clinical interpretation that the federal investigators needed context for. The billing contractor's contract with the hospital was terminated in the 4th week. 3 administrative personnel who had been involved in the improper documentation process received formal notifications through the appropriate channels. The patients whose records had been affected were contacted and offered the correction process. Fitch resigned in the 6th week. His resignation was described publicly as voluntary. It may have been at the level where a person concludes that the alternative is worse. I did not know the specifics of what had been found in relation to his involvement, and I did not seek them. What I knew was that the floor functioned after his departure, that the rotating attendings absorbed the coverage with the adaptability that physicians develop in institutional environments, and that the patients in the military wing continued to receive the care they needed. Stiles remained in her position. That was the outcome I found hardest to absorb with full equanimity. She had sat in the conference room that morning and managed the delivery of a false finding in the practiced tone of someone doing a routine administrative task. The investigation had found that her involvement was peripheral, that she had been acting on direction from above rather than initiating, and that the standards for action against her involvement did not meet the threshold. Those were the findings. I held them without pretending they were comfortable. On the last day of the 11th week, I came in for my shift and found the box still at the end of the nursing station, exactly where it had been placed. Pharaoh had maintained it there. I did not know whether that was intentional or simply the accumulation of other priorities, but it felt like something, and I let it feel like something. I picked it up. I took it to my locker. I put everything back where it belonged. I came out to the station. I picked up the first chart of the shift. I started reading. The ward went on, so did the work.